want to really dedicate this talk to Linda. Her birthday's next week. And our anniversary, I won't tell you how many years, but...
No, but she looks great.
But it's up there in the world next week.
What's the anniversary and her birthday around the same time?
Yeah, a few days apart. Okay.
That was your birthday gift to have?
No, once I bought lamb chops because she liked lamb chops. We went out for Pesach, for Purim. I couldn't believe it. I never went out for Purim Suda. Mm-hmm. We always had home. The restaurants, it was packed.
Oh, really?
It was packed.
When was this?
Purim. This Purim, we went out.
Oh, really?
We went out, and you could. Some people waited 2 hours to online. I mean,
which restaurant is this?
Oh, there was the Fleischig one. I forget already the names, but I never realized how many people go out for the
holiday. They celebrate.
For the holiday, yeah, very good. Anyway, interesting. Okay. A year ago, I gave a talk on Purim, and I had in there the general orientation and the chidush that I developed, and I'll talk a little bit about that as a summary in the middle of this talk tonight. But when I looked over the tape, I realized that there were many, many points that were not put in the text, put in the
your text.
Yeah, in the text, and most of them are in the book, if not all of them are in the book on Purim, which everybody has. Okay. So I want to start tonight with a few linguistic points, and then we'll move into a few substantive, conceptual points. So the first thing is, the last chapter, chapter 10, has 3 psukim, and it says that Achashverosh placed a tax upon the land and upon the islands of the sea, and he was great, and he had an account of the greatness of Mordechai and how the king promoted him. He says, these are recorded in the Book of Chronicles of the Kings of Paras Umadar. Well, first problem. Throughout the text, it says, Modai Uparas. But as I mentioned once before, a number of times, part of the methodology in the Purim text, Chazal organized the text, and it has Chazal's methodology, including word order, letters missing, letters taken out, associations. When Esther asks for machar, machar means latid lavo, the time to come. In other words, Chazal, in their methodology in writing up this Purim story, this Megillah, put into the text their methodology. And I mentioned once before, that's what got me into the text in the first place. I was working on drash in Chazal, the methods they use in making drashot, and I was concerned with that. And then my attention, either I saw it myself or somebody told me, Chazal organized the Megillah. Well, that means that they must have put in the Megillah their methodology. So, because I had no interest in Purim especially, So then, of course, I got to the Megillah, and I saw right away Vashti Amalka, Amalka Vashti, and so on and so on. All of these methodological techniques, and so I forgot to worry about the techniques and said, look, I'm reading the Megillah all my life. Maybe I should reread it with a little more care. And since that time has been the publication of this small book on Purim of 185 pages and another one waiting to get published of 375 pages, which has much more linguistics and Chazal in it. But anyway, I realized that I was reading it, but I didn't catch so many things. So the first point for tonight is, throughout the text it says, Paras Umadai. Why does it say over here, Modai? Why does it say Paras Umadai over here, and the other place it says Modai Uparas? Okay. So, they made a mistake here. See, the translation, I'm reading a translation, they translated it wrong. They didn't read it. They didn't read it. They didn't read it. The text says, Divrei Hayamim, the Chronicles, L'malchei Modai Uparas. He translates it, kings of Persia and Madai. You know, and there's 4 places where it says Poros uMadai. Over here it says Madai uParas. But he didn't catch it, the translator. And he translated it the usual way, because I'm looking at it, there's something wrong. It doesn't fit. Anyway, so the question is, why the change? So, when you look around for an explanation, I didn't find any. And so I was left with a question that where is this exception? Why is there an exception to the rule? If the general rule in 4 or 5 places is Paras uMadai, and over here it's Madai uParas, what is the explanation? If you're having a principle or a rule, you want to have everything under the rule and not exceptions that you can't explain. If you can explain it, it's fine. And lo and behold, there is an explanation. There is an explanation. Throughout Megillat Esther, one of the methodological techniques was the change of word order. Like Vashti, Amalka, Amalka, Vashti, and so on. In 4 places, 1, 3, 14, 18, 19, where it says, mentions the name of the kingdom ruled by Achashverosh, it says Paras uMadai, not Madai uParas. Why the change here? This is not an example of Chazal methodology. Why not? Why not? Because the pasuk is about Mordechai's greatness and exploits having been written up in the history in Chronicle. Hence it says Madai before Paras, because in the beginning, in the early history of this area, it was called Paras Madai. But in the latter history, these things switched around, and Madai became the center of the civilization, and Paras was the second. So it's not an example of Chazal word order change, but is true to the fact. And when you look into the material, you see that it was 3,400 mile extent was the Paras Madai and so on and so on. And you look in Daniel 6:9 and 8:20, where the early history of Paras Madai is being spoken about, you see they use the language of Madai uParas, switching the language. Another beautiful example of the exactitude with which Chazal, and now in this case, are putting together the text. The Gemara says, Kotvu, they wrote. It doesn't mean they wrote from scratch, because historically we know there were writing that came down which were a proto-Esther and a different version and so forth, and there was information orally and written that came down from the time of the story, when the story takes place. So when they said katvu, they wrote, they did not mean from scratch, they meant, I say, organized. They had all the material and they reorganized or organized the text in accordance with their methodology. You should know that in the scholarship world of people who are studying the Megillat Esther from the non-religious, non-Torah point of view, most of the people, if not all, conclude that this is a story. In the last talk I mentioned about that, I said this is what we would call a historical novel. In other words, the literary form is a literature, a story. And then it has a historical dimension. And in historical novels, you can have things, events, people, things going on that are not historical, together with things that are historical. In other words, you're not, the author who's writing the book is not limited to history, and not limited to literature, to fiction. And therefore, if you take the story, the Megillat Esther, as a story, or we call a historical novel, you can ask literary questions and get literary answers. Like, is there a plot in the story? Who are the characters? And so on and so on. First order characters of Haman, Mordechai, and so on and so on and so on. And then second order characters, like anything in analyzing a play. If you had to put it on Broadway, you'd have to do all this analysis. Okay. So here we see the exactitude of the text. Okay. So that's the first point about Parashah Monday. Now, let's jump to Haman's sons. Haman had 10 sons. Okay? When you look at the language of the 10 sons, we say it in the shul in one breath, right? We say it in one breath, and okay, it's part of the halakha and the minhagim and so on and so on and so on. But the point is, and Chazal talk about Haman's sons did tshuva, and I'm not getting into any of that for the moment tonight. But I discovered that, like in all of the Chumash material and in Chazal, names of people, of places, carry fantastic amounts of information. Instead of having to write sentences of what happened at a certain time and so on and so on, in the analysis, the linguistic analysis of the different names of places and people and so forth, one has much information that you would bypass without the analysis of the names. The famous example I gave was that in the Chumash, 10 generations from Adar Rishon to Noach, and then from Noach to Avram, if you analyze the names linguistically, you see that the names refer to the characteristics of society and civilization before the Hebrews came on the scene. So, if you look at the name, it's only the name. It says so-and-so ben so-and-so, so-and-so ben so-and-so. It's only the name. But if you look at make the analysis, you come up with a very interesting thing. It turned out, after I made the analysis, it gave you the institutions, the characteristics of society and civilization that were operative before Yisrael came on the scene. This is the early chapter 5, before Noach and so forth. Okay, so you see this. So, for example, it said when society began to develop, to bury the dead. When they started some kind of a rudimentary education. And in other words, they took characteristics of society and civilization and built it into a name. And so when you now look back and read it, you have 10 pieces. So instead of saying, oh, in the civilization at the time, they had the first beginnings of education, of taking it seriously, and so on and so on and so on, it's done in 3 words. So-and-so ben so-and-so, that gives you the material. So, what turns out is that this methodology of making the linguistic analysis of the words carries over into, for us, into Persia. So, when you look at the names of Haman's sons, I have the Persian dictionary. It said, okay, name Haman's son. What am I going to say? What are you going to do? I mean, that's the name. That's all you get. So you have a big, thick dictionary, and that's all you got from the analysis. When you make the analysis, it turns out that the names are 2 syllables. Parshandata, 2 or 3. Dalphon, Asparta, Porata, Adalia. It turns out that most of them have 2 or 3 syllables, and there's a first syllable and a last syllable, and it turns out, upon analysis of the language, of the name, that's all we have is the name. That's all we have is the name, remember. So it turns out, upon analysis, that the first part indicates success, victory, enjoyment of life, and so forth, and the second part indicates defeat. And so there's like a swing up and a swing down, a swing up and a swing down. Well, lo b'mekra, that's not by chance. You know, as if they're using this knowledge that I'm using, which, why shouldn't they have it? That's the Egyptian basis of biblical Hebrew. So if they're using that material in writing up the Megillah, so these are Persian names, but they are Hebraicized. I mean, each of the names is given in Hebrew. And in the text it's the same thing. So when you say Esther is a Persian name, or Mordecai, or whatever, maybe that's true, maybe that's not. But that's not the point here. All the names in the Megillah are amenable to analysis in Hebrew, not in Persian, not in the other language. And so you have this thing, so for example, 10 sons of Haman. Okay? They are different statements of Haman's power having come to an end. The first part of the name is Haman at his height, whereas the second part of the name is Haman in his fall from power and prestige. And I gave you the names, and I made the linguistic analysis to give you one. You don't have to go through all of them, but they're in the book here. But to give you one, when you analyze the name, it's either 3-syllable or 2-syllable. So it's Par Shan Data. Par Shan Data. So Parshan is all ideas of fructification, production, fecundity. Shein, Shin Nun, having changed, passed from one state into another. This is the development and continuation of Haman in the world until B'yamei HaMashiach, when it will be self-destruct, fall by the weight of its own falsehood. And there may be a reference here to a number of the psukim in the text. But the basic point is, by making the analysis in detail, not just because I always skip them over because it's just you take my word for it. But when you take Dalphone is the next one, is the idea of every extraction, removal, attenuation, enfeeblement, emptiness. Fun, that's Dal Lamed. Fun, the second part of the name. Fun is causing hesitation, disturbance, and an irritated and sad face. This will be Haman in its self-destruction b'yamei HaMashiach. In other words, the first part of the name is the victory, the dimension of that, and the second part of the name is the defeat. And so, lo b'mikra, all 10 names have the same basic structure with different components. Victory in war, and so on and so on, and then defeat at the end. And so you have this whole thing, and I made them in detail to break down the analysis of the name into its component parts. And indeed, in this Egyptian base of Hebrew that I work with, that you heard so many times, in this Egyptian base of Hebrew, that's the way the words are put together. The letters are put together in such a way that each letter has a meaning, a range of meaning, a package of meaning. But it combines with another letter and keeps its same meaning, but they somehow it modifies the next one. So the Aleph has a meaning by itself, but you only have 22 letters. You can't get a lexicon from 22 letters. But if you multiply by 2, we have 22 times 22 is 400 something, and some are not used. So the entire lexicon of biblical Hebrew is reduced to 22 by 22, minus a few that are not used, not in use, but are used in Ethiopia and in Arabic, because in this dictionary that I use, he gives you the Ethiopic and the Arabic, and many times you have differences, but sometimes you see that they follow the same track, or have the same basic idea but applied in a different direction. But the basic point is that the language, the hieroglyphic-based Hebrew, has this ability to be parsed, to analyze the words in terms of the components. And it's a 2-letter language. So here we have Parshan Data, Par, Shan, Pei Resh, Shin Nun, and where are we here? Whatever. Parshan. Okay. In any event, you have the basic components, and you make the analysis, and you come up with these meanings of the terms. And so this point is an example. That's enough I could read. And you see, in here, Adalia is one of the sons. but we just had Dal in another name. But when you make the analysis, that meaning that was in that one with Daled Lamed, the Daled Lamed here carries the same meaning, but now it's connected to the rest of the word, of the name. So I was amazed when I first did it. But after I've done 1,000 and 2,000 names and places, that's fingerprints, the burden of exhibitions on somebody else who wants to do something different. If somebody wants to, first of all, if you're satisfied with the dictionary definition, it's nothing, it's just a name. Kol hakavod. But if you want to analyze the thing, and somebody does make an analysis, and it's reasonable and makes sense and fits the material, the burden of exhibition is on somebody else. Now, from my understanding, there's so many perushim on Megillat Esther over the years by all of our greats, but apparently nobody caught all of this. Because this is strictly linguistic. If you have to come in with the language of the biblical Hebrew, we call it restored, and with that language you have the tool that, for whatever the reason, got lost, was eclipsed out, and our grammarians and everything has come from Ezra, from Ibn Ezra, which is late in the picture, and not from this whole understanding. There's a whole grammar. There's a whole grammar to this language, where there's prefixes, suffixes of a letter, a prefix or a suffix, and then there's splitting in the middle. You could have Daled Lamed, and then you can have Daled Vav Lamed. So the root is Daled Lamed, but the Vav is an addition in the middle, and that has meaning. And so the text has these variations, and when I had to make the analysis of 1,000, 2,000 names, I just sat with a piece of paper and took the combinations. I took all the combinations, wrote them down, and then analyzed them. And then, from the context and from the story and the rest, you could sort of make a judgment of what is the root. But sometimes you do get stuck and you can't really have a clean thing. And sometimes the same word has two different meanings in the hieroglyphic, but it has the same letters, and so you have to be able to differentiate those. But that's part of the work that goes into making the analysis. I just have to do it by chance, put down the 6, 7 variations, and say, is this a prefix? Is this a suffix? Is this something in the middle? It's breaking it up, but it can only be 2 letters. Yashav, Yud, Shin, Bet, 3 letters. Well, in this, it has to be 2 letters. So it could be Yud, Shin, Shin, Vav, right? So that you analyze, break it up into units, and the units must be either 1 letter, prefixes, suffixes are in the middle, or 2 letters, root, with the third either being a suffix or a prefix. If you have 3 letters and you only need 2, 2 is the root. So that's part of the analysis, the methodology for the analysis. I just did it by pure chance, but after a while you can make guesses. After you're in the middle, you can make a good guess as to what they're talking about. Okay, so this is the 10 sons of Haman. Okay. The other illustration for tonight is the, you heard it a few times, on different occasions, is the first chapter of the text, which talks about the 7 Yodeitim, 7 astrologers, were advisors to the king. Okay? And he had 7 attendants, people who took care of his personal needs. Okay. So when you look carefully at the text, you see the 7 astrologers were one set. There are no vowels. There's 7 in one set. There's no vowels in between. When you look at the 7 attendants, there's 3 classes. There's 4, then a vav, 2, then a vav, and 1. So it's 4, 2, and 1. The vav is indicative of a different class, a different set. Again, the beauty of the exactness of the text. Okay, so what do we find out? Make the analysis, The 7 names of those people are the names of the constellations that were used in the astrology. So it said they were Yodeitim, they were the astrologers, that's that's who they were. But the names carry the information as to which constellations were being used. And there was an astrology based on 7, astrology based on 12, and different astrologies. The one here was based on 7. And when I went to the encyclopedia and I checked out the names of the constellations and how they look, they give you the dipper and this and so on. And then I realized that an hourglass had respect to Mars, and the symbols that are used in the astrology fit the picture. And so you make the analysis of each of the names, and you get the names of the constellations that were used by these astrologers. It's one set of 7 because there's no special properties. Then I went to the other 7 attendants of the king, and I started with the bottom, set of 1. It turned out to be related to barbering. That had to do with barbering the king, combing the hair and taking all this kind of stuff. And so when you make the analysis, that was the set of 1. Then I went to the set of 2. It's 4, 2, and 1. 1, barbering. The next one, preparation of drinks. Okay, preparation of drinks. I figured right away the next one's going to be preparation of foods. Lo and behold, I got a big surprise. When I made the analysis, it turned out it said preparation of drinks. Twice. Well, I didn't look carefully. When you look carefully and you fill in the linguistic analysis, it turns out that there's drinks by compression, squeezing, and there's drinks by fermentation. And so, when you look more carefully at the linguistic analysis, it's barbering, 2 types of drink preparations, those were fermentation and those by squeezing, and the first 4 have to do with meat, cakes, and so forth. In other words, the rest of the edibles of the king. And so here you have again, have the analysis, 4, 2, and 1, and with the surprise that I got, because lo and behold, it wasn't food and drink, it was drink, 2 types of drink, by fermentation and by compression, by squeezing the fruit, and so forth. So again, we see the exactness and the beauty of the text, and we're seeing an exemplification of the language, which is not only in the Chumash, but as late as the Megillat Esther, which is whatever it is before the destruction of, certainly way before the Second Temple and so forth. But the point is, I'm not going into the history, but the point is that the language remained, at least by Chazal, who put together this text. They used that language and had knowledge of what I'm talking about in order to do it. Otherwise, how would they do it? By chance? How would they do it? There's a structure here in the language. Okay, so here we have the second example. Bigta is one of the people of the first 4. That which nourishes, which acts upon the interior, exercising a force which is extensive and reciprocally increasing. Not unreasonably here, a baker of bread and cake. In other words, I'm just taking from the dictionary, this Egyptian-based dictionary, which is put in more abstract language, and then localizing it to what happens. So when you read this particular one, it seems that it fits best the one who's preparing bread and cakes and not meat and so on and so on and so on. One of the other ones yields and shows you that. So again, don't misunderstand. There is a judgment to be made by the person making the analysis. In other words, so somebody can say, well, look, you missed it. This is not what's talking about. They're not talking about a baker of bread and cakes. Okay, I bow. I'm not, but in general, there's enough done with the analysis of these names to indicate a realm of chidushim about the Megillah text. You know, for Torah people to get one chiddush on a text, that's a big contribution. I mean, you know, you think differently about the material. Okay, so this is an example of the seven attendants of the king. Okay. Now, I said in the beginning, a year ago in the talk, that this was a historical novel where not everything is historically true to fact, and things could be fiction. So, for example, a king in Persia at the time could only marry somebody from royal families. That was the custom. And so that was the fact, historical fact. But in the text, Esther marries the king. So we have to, if we understand the text as a story, and it has a plot, and it has the development of the plot, which requires that she marry the king, literally, from the plot. Therefore, questions that say, how could she marry a non-Jew, and so on, are irrelevant, completely. Completely irrelevant to the story. No, first of all, there's an irrelevance, and that it's not according to fact. That's not the way it was done. You had to come from a royal family. So in addition to that, you're now saying if it's a story, and this is required, it's required that she marries the king. So she's not Mordechai's wife. Chazal talking about Mordechai's wife and so on. Now, this is not to denigrate in any way Chazal. This is to say that even though Chazal wrote the text, when they are discussing the text in the context of the Gemara, for example, or in Midrash, one has to examine the frame of reference in terms of which they're making statements that are not true to the story. The Maharal wrote a big perush called Or Chadash on Megillat Esther, and says that when the king invited Vashti to his party, so she was arum, naked. So Maharal points out that's degrading. Nobody invites a queen naked. I mean, you're making the person into some kind of a psychopath or something. I mean, so it's degrading. So the point is, if you understand the story in terms of the plot, arum here means naked of her status of queen as the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. She was the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar in exile. He lost his kingship. He was Bavel. He lost his kingship to Porus. So she had two statuses of queen, of being a queen. She was queen in exile from the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar, and she was queen by being married to Achashverosh. Well, that's fundamental in the story, that when he took another queen, not only did he not take her from a royal family, okay, we know she's Jewish. He doesn't know that. Eventually that will become part of the plot and development. At a certain point he finds out that she's Jewish, and so on and so on and so on. But the basic point over here is that he took somebody as for a queen who had no lineage. Indeed, in the text, the text usually has a rule that when you introduce somebody, you introduce him with who he was, Ben so-and-so, Ben so-and-so. That's the general rule in the Chumash. The first time the name appears, it has a little bit of explanation of who it was. But in Esther, for example, like in Mordechai and Haman, in Mordechai it tells you who Mordechai was, Ben so-and-so, Ben Meish, from the tribe of Binyamin, and so on. It gives you the lineage. When Esther is introduced, there's no lineage. It just says, Ein la of V'ain. She didn't have a father and a mother. She was orphan. And so, why? Why the exception to the rule? Later, way at the end of the text, in chapter 9, is given her lineage. But why not where it belongs? It's in the wrong place. It should follow the rule. But it's not following the rule because in the story, Esther is the queen of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the form of Hashgacha. That's the story. The characters, the 5 characters represent different ideas. Esther represents Astir Hastir, the hiddenness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, how he works in Hashgacha, where events that are look against the Jews turn out to be for the Jews and so forth. We'll get to that right away. But the basic point is that's Hashgacha. Esther is, when the Gemara asks the question, Esther Minayin, where do we get the term Esther? So we get it from the Chumash, where Hashem hides and doesn't. We can't see the workings of the Hashgacha. Okay, but Hashem knows the workings of the Hashgacha, and so has this whole dimension. Indeed, just as an aside, why did Chazal opt to write the Megillah in the form of a story, historical novel? Because the subject matter of the text is Hashgacha, is providence, how Hashem works in history in relation to the Klal Yisrael. We're going to talk about that a little later, but the basic point is that's the subject. For the human being, writing a novel is the closest we can come to knowing the events from the beginning, how they began, and how they turn out. The author of the text, the author of writing a historical novel, knows the beginning and knows the end. So the reason Chazal put this form was to indicate that this is the closest we can come to know how HaKadosh Baruch Hu works in terms of events in history. And so, again, the famous question, why is there no name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Elohim or Hashem, in the Megillah story? Well, my answer is simple as could be. It'll disturb the plot. The plot is, he banished Vashti because she wouldn't come to his party as his queen. He wanted her to come to his party as his queen only. But Arum, stripped of her other status. And indeed, what's her name? Vashti. Ushtei. Shtei is 2. Ushtei is 2. Vashti had 2 queenships. And so it's also Vayesht in the Yitzchak giving the bracha to Esav and Yaakov. They talk about Vayesht, he drank. That's the same letters as Vashti. But the basic point is that Vashti had 2. She had 2 statuses as queen. So he banished her because she didn't want to give up her queenship, being the granddaughter of Nebuchadnezzar. But what's the story? She's the Malka of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the form of Hashgacha. Well, she also has 2 statuses of queenship, namely the Malka of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Malka, the queen of the king. And so that's the plot structure. The plot develops, he doesn't know that. He said, I'll never get a problem like Vashti again. That she's not going to come to me on my terms with her own queenship because she's married to me, the king. And he got it back in spades. He got it back and didn't realize that who was running the show here. As the text unfolds, he offers Esther the kingship, half, and she turns it down. The Mordechai would accept it right away. To have clout in Washington is a big thing. But she turns it down 3 times. Because as the queen of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the form of Hashgacha, she deserves the whole, the total. It should have been a coup d'etat story. But instead of a coup d'etat story, it indicates, at the analysis of in the last chapters, chapter 8, chapter 9, it indicates how, in the beginning, she was the shliach, the messenger of Mordechai. In the middle of the story, she works together with Mordechai, And at the end of the story, she is the ruler of Mordechai. And indeed, in the analysis of the text, she is the ruler of Achashverosh. That's the whole development of the story. It has these two parts, the Mordechai Haman part and the Esther Achashverosh part. And the whole analysis of the story comes from the beginning of the plot. So she had to marry the king to get the double status and to get the plot moving. And that's how the thing works. So here you see the exactitude, the beauty, the whole dimensionality of the text in terms of this beginning with Vashti, going through Esther. He had to marry her. So questions, the point of this little piece is just to indicate that you could, just as you could ask literary questions, okay, and get different types of answers in terms of the plot and development and so on, sometimes you ask questions that are from left field. What does this have to do with the story? In the beginning, it's, quote, not the fact. I mean, that's the first level. Then there's another level where, if you understand the story properly, she had to marry the king. It has nothing to do with it. He was Jewish, not Jewish. That's not the issue. So to understand Chazal, one has to go to Chazal and analyze the frame, the meaning frame that they're trying to do. If they're trying to get a point across about illicit relations, for example, if that's the context, and they use this as an example, well, they've said, look, we're not dealing with the story. We're dealing with something else. And then that something else, it comes to mind, Achashverosh is a good example, so we're going to put that in. And they write it up, Achashverosh is a good example. But has nothing to do, you can't use that and say, oh, it's all wrong. This whole analysis is wrong. It's not a historical novel because Chazal say that he killed. Chazal say he killed her. He killed her. He didn't kill her. The text doesn't say he killed Vashti. He banished her. He banished her from the queenship and took Bimkom Esther. And so it allows you the proper understanding of the story as a story allows you to ask the proper questions, give different kinds of answers, and at the same time in no way negate Chazal, who are not concerned with the context here. They're not concerned with that. They say, I'm talking about something else. And what comes to mind is Achashverosh. Fine. And over time, things change. And so, Chazal may have been writing 100 years after, and things shifted, and therefore they went with the flow. For example, in 333, in the law of Constantine, 333 Christian era, they forbade the Jews to celebrate Purim. Why? Because the Jews identified Haman with Yeshu. And so in the law, there was a clause not to tell us. So, okay, now, that wasn't the case 300 years before that time. So Chazal, seeing the living amongst in this picture, Chazal are not stupid. I mean, they relate. When they're making a drash and so they relate to where we are. So if things change significantly, like all of a sudden there's a law on the books that was never on the books, and there was a grassroots movement of people identifying Haman with Yeshu and so on, there's no basis for that. Where's the basis of Haman for Yeshu? Haman represents Amalek. In the text it tells you explicitly, it gives you his lineage, and it says he represents Amalek, the anti-life principle in Israel, and so on and so on. So he's nothing to do with Yeshu. But grassroots, that's what came up. So Chazal then related to that when they talked about the story. So you'll see, at least what I found was that whereas on the surface you would say, oh, wait a minute, you're all wrong, Chazal, how can you marry a non-Jew, and so on and so on and so on. It's irrelevant. Conceptually irrelevant to the story. It has nothing to do with it. So you could ask the question in a different context, get a different answer, and a different set of points. So again, you see the same exactitude of the orientation and the importance of getting it right in the first place. Now, apparently, all the Meforshim on Megillat Esther, the Torah people, missed all of this and considered it as history, and had questions that were stuck. For example, Achashverosh was Xerxes, one of the kings of Persia. His wife's name was Amistris, Amistris. Known, indicated in other sources, his wife was a mistress. His wife is Vashti. Well, what we do? We made a mistake. Chazal made a mistake. They didn't know the history. His wife is our mistress. In one account that I read by a Greek writer, it said that Vashti was Achashverosh's mother. That was a myth, not a myth, whatever the context was. The point being that some questions will be relevant and require answers from inside your assumptions, and some questions are totally irrelevant and nothing to do with the story. So a guy, you can kill the story by bringing in questions that are irrelevant to the story. It has nothing to do with the issue. She had to marry the king because that's the general structure of the plot. And there's no God mentioned and so on, so all of these different points. Okay, the tree. They prepared a tree to hang Mordechai. Okay? How tall is the tree? 50. How much is an alma? How much is an alma? A little more than a yard. 160 feet tall. Granted, there are some redwoods, and there are some, when I went to make these shelves in the way early years, I had the glass bricks and I wanted shelves. I went to the lumberyard in 138th Street in Harlem River. They're big, you look at that train, nice whole section, it smells like hell. But I went there and I bought a big lumberyard to buy, I want walnut, like this piece is walnut. I like walnut, a beautiful grain. I walk in there and I say, I want to make shelves, I need a shelf, this length, 20 feet long, Guy looks at me, I had a U-Haul. Remember those U-Hauls you rented and you put things on the back? This was an open one, because I figure I'm going to buy shelves, long things, it's going to stick out with a red flag. And so I came in there and I said, I want 20 feet shelves, eight shelves in walnut. The guy says, you want me to manufacture the tree? I mean, there's walnut, but first of all, it has to be 12 inches wide, 30 centimeters to fit in the glass brick. And the guy says, look, he says, unless you got a big bankroll, I can go search for you, but it's a big job. It's not so easy to get walnut 20 feet long. Okay, so he says, take mahogany. And this is mahogany. And yours truly, I got this from a lumberyard, and I didn't have the money at the time. I was always short, and to plane it down. So this wood came with roughage on both sides of the wood. I planed it flat and put it up together and so on, and the result was, for 100 years, we still have these bookcases that are made of glass bricks. In the States, we had lights behind it, so we had nice, like Motzei Shabbat, people come over, and it was very nice to dim the lights and put on these red and green, orange lights in the back of the bookcase. Nobody was going to read anything there anyway, for the time being. But anyway, this is the basic point. So what are we talking about? 160 feet high? First of all, you need a tremendous amount of stability to hold 160 feet in a straight line. So obviously, this is fiction. 50 amas, whenever there's measurements, the Torah person right away has to associate. Part of methodology in Chazal is association. Like I said, when Esther asks for machar is latid labo, the time to come. And so, in other words, there are associations that every Torah person is familiar with. That's the whole. And so, with 50 Amma, the Teva Shel Noach was 50 Amma in length. Okay, the 50 is the Yovel year, is the 50, in the Mashiach context of talking about Mashiach, there's a completion of a 50-year cycle, so the 50th year is Mashiach, and so forth. And the other example we have is Shavuot, which is the 7 times 7 plus 1. It's 50. Okay, so all I could come up with on this particular point was that this was representative of the Yovel, that was the entry to Mashiach, but that's as far as I got. I couldn't find any other clue as to why it was 50 Amot in terms of thing, except that it represented something in the text, in the Torah thing. Just like the figures, the people represented different concepts. Mordechai represented Chazal, the Torah orientation to things, and Esther represented Hashgacha, Vashti we spoke about, Haman represented Amalek, and the king, Achashverosh, in my analysis, represented universalized religion. I didn't spend a lot of time on that, but that's a very big point. It's a big chiddush that he made his party to celebrate universalized religion. What does that mean? That means there's a God, King of Kings, then there's localization of the God in terms of society. But what was important was they all came from this universal God. And that's a question in Judaism, whether Judaism is saying, if you have God, and he didn't give the Torah to Yisrael, by definition, it's not God. There can't be a God that created the world, but did not give the Torah to Yisrael. It's a contradiction in terms. Now that's a very subtle point, because I try to show, in both books, but in the big one especially, how this operated and how one of the reasons why Esther couldn't take half the kingdom and so on was because Achashverosh represented what was called the King of Kings, with localizations that, basically speaking, are all the same. The empire was 3,400 miles in extent, and the general orientation was leave the cultures alone with their own ethnocentrism, and that will keep them unified and in line, as long as they pay taxes and are ready for military if necessary. And so that was the general policy in these big nation states at the time, including Persia. The whole idea of 3,400 miles is a big front. And to avoid revolution and discontent and so forth, the general orientation that comes through in Persian history as well. I'm just making it short, but in the Persian history, this was part of the picture of how the ethnocentrism was allowed to flourish in terms of different societies that were separated, and it maintained domestic tranquility. And so there was no revolution and so forth. Okay, so my point was that the king represented universalized religion, and then with the other four, and the text, in terms of the story and the plot, is working out the implications of all of this. And furthermore, because the king represented universalized religion, there's two parts to the story. There's an Esther Achashverosh part. How does Judaism, how does Torah look at universalized religion? That's what the king represents. That's one question. And then there's another part. What do the Jews do when they live under tyrants? And that's the Mordechai Haman part. When they have somebody who wants to organize and destroy them from the beginning to the end, how do we relate? And then the Gemara talks a lot about the Roman period of Rabbi Akiva and so on. False Mashiach, not Mashiach, but how do we relate to the Romans? So we decided to fight, and we lost the battle, and so on, as you know from Jewish history. Okay, so the point is, there are two dimensions to the story. What has come down in the celebration of Purim has been primarily, almost exclusively, the Mordechai Haman part of the story. And the Esther Achashverosh part of the story, the answer to that question has been eclipsed. That there are two parts to the story is indicative. At the end of the story, the whole business of those who celebrated on the 15th and those who celebrated on the 14th, we have right there two separate celebrations. Eventually they were put together into one, and they had to do with walled cities and a lot of things in the halakha, which is all irrelevant to the story. In the story, there are two components. Amalek is not Achashverosh, that's Haman. So Amalek can be called political enemy of the Jews. And Achashverosh, the theological enemy of the Jews. The universalized religion has to be constantly watched and fought such that we don't undo all the detail, the localization. For us, it's the localization of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that's so fundamental. And so on the Torah line, strictly speaking, the God who created the world gave the Torah to Yisrael. That's not popular today. But that's the Torah orientation. As you see it in the Chazal, you see it in the material, and you see it in the Megillat Esther. And so you have these two pieces of the story, and indicative of that is you have the two different celebrations, and you have Shlach Manot Ish L'Re'ehu on the Haman Mordechai part of the story, and on the Esther Achashverosh part of the story, because Esther asks for Machar, which is the 15th. So it's Esther who wants that extra day to degrade Haman's sons who were killed before. But the point is, there are two pieces. And so Mordechai Haman part of the story was Shlach Manot Ish L'Re'ehu. And the Esther Achashverosh part adds, in addition to Shlach Manot Ish L'Re'ehu, U'matanot La'evyonim. Well, there's two parts of the story. There's this part of the story, the Esther part, which has an added piece. Matanot Levyonim. Alkabetz, who wrote L'chododi, he wrote a Kabbalah Perush on the Megillat Esther, and in there he translates Evyon not as poor. Its usual translation is poor, a poor person. He translates it as estranged,
Outcast.
Outcast, yeah, outcast. He as what's the word I use?
Rejected.
Rejected. He translates Evyon as rejected. His proof text, the very next phrase in Megillat Esther is V'kibel ha-Yehudim. What's wrong? Yehudim is plural. Yehudim is plural. Singular is Yehudi. So it should have said V'kiblu ha-Yehudim. But in the Purim text, in Megillat Esther, there's three places where when it says Kibel and so on, it's without the letter taken out, and that's Chazal methodology. And so here, Alkabetz proves his point and says, our bottom line is Chaverim Kol Yisrael. Our bottom line is, to use the Latin phrase on the dollar bill, e pluribus unum. Instead of calling each other Nazis, and instead of belittling each other, we have to say we unite together as an Am Yisrael, but we allow differences. We don't throw people out. We don't reject. And that's the teaching of Megillat Esther. I wrote a piece for the Jerusalem Post, and so the guy, he put it in because it's so fantastic modern. The Megillah, up to the Megillah piece, we're going to do a little more analysis of the text, but the basic teaching, what do we do, Tachlis? What do we do, Tachlis? It's as modern as could be. Our main problem is the unity of Klal Yisrael, and especially in Eretz Yisrael. So it's not eliminating the Galut, but it's saying especially in Eretz Yisrael. Our major problem is how do we bob and weave between a unification and a difference of opinion, difference of emphases. When somebody in the contemporary frame, this problem has taken the form of Jewishness. There's Judaism, the religion, and there's Jewishness, the sensitivity and the feeling. And this guy says, I'm a Jew, but I don't eat kosher. But what do we do with that? That's 90% of the people. What do we do with that? We say, well, I just saw in the paper, there was something, a headline about, I didn't read it, I just was pushing it aside to clean the table. And I saw something about the rabbis came out that somebody can drive to eat a Suda. I didn't read the article, I don't know what they're talking about. But, well, that's unheard of. I mean, what do you mean? We were brought up, you couldn't invite somebody, even till today. If the person lives too far away, and we figure they're going to drive, we don't invite them. No, that's the way we were brought up. Well, there's a realization here. Whatever it is, the good or bad, I'm not interested in the politics for the moment, but the basic point is that how do we relate to the guy, that you don't have to be Jewish to eat leavies. I mean, so the guy eats leavies, but he eats leavies on Pesach. But that's our problem. How do we put together and allow for these differences of emphasis, differences of sensitivity, and at the same time give due to the non-rejecting and accepting those with different opinions. Okay, that's the problem. So here we have the modern point of the story. Okay, now let this suffice for some linguistic points that were details that enhance and build up all the general points that I made in last year's talk. Okay, but now I want to get to a few substantive points. So first of all, the text is concerned with hashgacha. The way it's presenting that, the providence, is by making statements in chapter 3 in the mouth of Haman that are against the Jews, to destroy the Jews, weaken the Jews, and so on and so on. And then, in chapter 8, to take the very same language and turn them upside down and have them react on Haman and his followers and not on the Jews. So, that's the core of Esther's representation. Esther represents hashgacha, providence, and the way the text is doing that is by strict language. And so in the book, this piece here on the hidden face of Purim, and in the big book, I showed by analysis, and I made a table to show you when you take the psukim from chapter 3 and you take the psukim from chapter 8, it's almost word for word. It's just visually jumps at you and says, well, that's hashgacha. What looks like bad for the Jews turns out to be good for the Jews, or at least bad for its enemies. And there's motifs of that. He who curses Israel becomes cursed, and so on and so on. I'm not going into all the Chazal. In the big book, I developed more of the Chazal to build up the aspects of the story. But here we have this basic orientation. Okay, so we have it being done by an analysis. For example, chapter 3, Pasuk 1, Vayikruhu Sifrei HaMelech. Chapter 8, Pasuk 9, Vayikruhu Sefer HaMelech. Chapter 3, B'chadash, or B'chodesh. Chapter 8, 9, B'chodesh. Now you go and make a list of the pieces in 8 and 3. It's obvious that this was the methodology that Chazal were using in this text, in this story, to show you the hafach, the opposite. What was set up one way against the Jews, against Yisrael, turned out to be for Yisrael, and so forth. And so you have this parallel, and done in parallel language. Indeed, you have the parallel language, and you have, where are we now? We have, well, I must have lost it, but anyway, I must have lost it, which I had the sheet here about the.
It's not the one on top there?
No, it's not the one on top. It's, because there are 10 conceptual ingredients in Hashgacha that are put in the text. So it's not only that, here we are, it's not only done by this linguistic method of comparison between chapter 3 and chapter 8, where you see, it's obvious when you put them side by side. You don't catch it often when you're reading the text in, straightforward, but when you put them together, it jumps at you and say, here it is. Okay, at this point in the story, there begins the working out of the plot and the series of turning around the would-be Hashgacha events. It is the most conceptual part of Megillat Esther. The components of Hashgacha are 10. Coincidence in the king not being able to sleep. In the story, the king can't sleep, and he calls for the book of the Chronicle, and so on and so on. Coincidence. Coincidence. More coincidence in their reading of the Sefer Zikronot to him. That they read the book to him, and then he heard about Mordechai, and he's been Mordechai. Number 3, logic and reason, on the basis of what the king read concerning Mordechai. He read what was in the Chronicle concerning Mordechai, and so he used his head, figured out who he was. So I put it down as logic and reason, as being a component in the Hashgacha. Number 4 is chance. In Haman's being in the Chatzir, in the courtyard, having come first thing in the morning to ask the king's permission to hang Mordechai the Jew. Okay? So it's chance. These are important because theologically, you see, in the big picture, all the ways events come about, develop, and change are included underneath the concept or the methodology of the Hashgacha, the turning around. So it's not a question here to say, well, there's no chance. Torah doesn't say that. Torah says there is chance, but it's put in a bigger frame. And so what's important here is the chance exemplifying the bigger frame of Hashgacha. So it allows a list of components of Hashgacha that are true to the reality. On a ordinary language understanding and experiential thing, there is such a thing as chance. There is such a thing as coincidence. When we put it in a big frame, and they all are functioning to turn around the destruction of the Jews to the blessing of the Jews, that whole frame has in it all of these ingredients, all of these components. And it would be really misplaced to theologically ask questions about the nature of chance in the Torah system. The Torah system is built on chance, built on probability, and so on, which are real de facto ingredients in ordinary life. I mean, so the fact that Haman was there and he came to hang Mordechai, well, it was pure chance. Achashverosh looked out the window and he saw Haman there readying the tree. Well, okay. Well, he didn't have to be there. If he didn't be there, so the story would have to be something else. So here you see how the plot is structured around the overall picture that I'm presenting, and as well these 8 or 9, I think 10 points here about the. Okay, so the king, so Mordechai chants. Number 4, chants in Haman's being in the Chatzir, having come first thing in the morning to ask the king's permission to hang Mordechai the Jew. 6:4. Reason in the king's wanting to get advice and or to conform to what he had in mind concerning the honor to be given to someone who saved the king's life. So I call that reason 6, 5, and 6. Reasonable misinterpretation of the situation in Haman's thinking that the king is talking about him. For how was Haman to know that the king had been up all night and he was thinking about Mordechai, not himself? Number 7, reasonable self-interest in accordance with the general rule to always ask for more so that one can settle for less if need be. That's in the section of chapter 6, pasuk 7 to 6:9. 8, emotional involvement, especially when it appears that yakar, endearment, and gedula, greatness, are coming one's way. Number 9, misinterpretation corrected, logical implication in opposites for Mordechai instead of Haman. So the basic structuration of the Hashgacha is in terms of opposites. That the events switch and go into their opposite. And that's where Megillat Esther remains. It doesn't go further. Because in the Kabbalah systematics and in Chazal, we can talk about opposites, and then Lamala Mina Hafachim. Hafachim is opposites, contraries. And then there's, on top of that, how can we get beyond opposites? It's the same analogous point about the contemporary picture. We need the unity, and we need the opposites. And we have to strike a balance between them such that one doesn't destroy the other. If we have too much unity, we have totalitarianism. We have top-downism. We have hitting the other guy because he has a different opinion. Like I always say, behind every liberal, there's a concern to say, look, if you're not a liberal, you're nobody. You're just nobody. You must be a liberal. Liberal egalitarian is the name of the day. So when you come and you say, look, let's make an analysis of the Federalist Papers in terms of liberal egalitarianism, and you'll see, when you read the Federalist Papers, it's a great book, but it's not liberal egalitarian. It includes the liberal egalitarian at the time, 200 years ago, but it's put into a larger framework of federation, what's that all about, states, central government, and so on and so on, and gives you a much richer picture of the political than just to say, well, here it is, king. The king, the king. Okay, so this is the basic point here about the components of Hashgacha. I tried to say here are the components of Hashgacha that are exemplified inside the text, in addition to the parallel between the two. Okay. There are a number of points left that I want to talk about. One is 75,000 people who were killed by the Jews on the 13th of Adar and who were celebrating on the 14th. Now, first of all, the number is staggering. The number is unbelievably out of proportion to reality of the time. Even though Porus and Mordai had a big army and so on, but you look at statistics about, take World War II, and what we had, I think, about 500,000 deaths in World War I. We had less in World War II. And the figures, the demography and the figures, somehow over here don't fit. And 75,000, that's Yankee Stadium filled. 75,000 people. and it's so artificial. I mean, nobody fought back. Nobody did anything. They let themselves be killed. If we're talking about a structure that there was killing, that Haman presented, kill the Jews, and then we need a counterpart, a hafach, an opposite, of kill the non-Jews, okay, killing, but why 75,000? That's a problem. Now, I probed that and didn't come up with anything that's rich, but a few points may help the situation, to understand the situation. First of all, it uses the word nekama, revenge, okay, taking revenge. The word milchama does not, war, the word for war, milchama, does not appear in Megillat Esther. It says that this action that Mordechai took with the blessing of the king, this action was a vengeance action, nekama. Now, I always felt that vengeance is not a Torah idea. Punishment, but not vengeance. And this plagued me no end, this piece in the Megillah, and historically thousands and thousands of Jews over the years, in addition to other reasons and practices and different things. It's not that people don't leave Judaism for one reason, but many included in their reason package the inability to accept this. How can the Jews just wipe out 75,000 people in one day? So that's a whole big issue. You should know also that the Akedah story has also turned thousands away over the years, because how even as a test, how can a Kadosh Baruch Hu test Abraham with such a test? And so, if you understand the story properly, you see what it's all about. And it was the moral of the story, as I presented a number of times. The moral of the story was that Abraham did not listen to the Elohim who told him to sacrifice his son, but listened to the Malach Hashem who told him not to sacrifice his son, to stop, not to sacrifice him. And so they give you a different analysis, which changes the whole meaning of the story, and at least makes it palatable to any person who in the past felt the story to be so against the Torah, against human nature, against the human being, that it was part of a package of leaving the system. Okay. So, what did I say? It turns out, I won't give the analysis here, it turns out that the moneh was a Persian coin. There was a coin in Persia called the moneh. Okay? So, shlach manot, sending portions. It says mana means also portion. Sending portions to the poor, or sending portions to your friends, whatever, what we call shlach manot. Shlach manot, sending manot, portions. Now, Chazal developed this into, it can't be stuck, it has to be different. I'm not interested in that for the moment. But the moneh was a Persian coin. It turns out, without giving you the arithmetic here, it turns out that if you take the amount of 10,000 kikar kesef, 10,000 silver bars, which was the money that Haman was negotiating with about for the Jews, and you relate that, break it down into manot, it's a coin, so it has that's a high value, but the low value was the manah. When you break it down into the manot, it turns out that the 75,000 equals the 10,000 kikar kesef. So there was a kind of an arithmetic tie-in between the number and the amount or the number that was used, or the value number of the Kikar Kesef. For what it's worth, that's all I could come up with on the 75,000. Why that's the case, why it should be. If by mana they meant each one gives 2 coins, not food and so on, but 2 coins as a remembrance of this Purim material, the victory and so forth, well, okay, so it's adding another dimension by saying if we're going to kill 75,000, we are making up for the monetary of 10,000 Kikar Kesef. The other point is that's against this idea, this thing. That's all I can come up with. The other idea is that when I learned Kabbalah with my teacher, Slotsky, so he said that in the Gemara, when the Gemara talks about Rabbi Akiva, the destruction of Rabbi Akiva and Yeshivot in the Roman period, and it says Esrim va'arba elef, then he had 24,000 students. That's out of the demography. He had 24. The Gemara is saying 24 heads. Aluf means head, like in modern Hebrew. Aluf, general, and so on. Aluf means head, leader. And so, in the Rabbi Akiva story, he said he was taught by his teachers. In the Kabbalah system, he was taught by his teachers that this simple pshat was Esrin ba'arba elef, or Aleph, with an Aleph. And so that what we had over here was 75 alafim, 75 heads, lower, of the organizing people. Okay, the generals, not the colonels, the middle or the lower order, and that this is what it's talking about. I, for one, left it open because I'm not satisfied with either, and I'm open if somebody comes up with something about why 75,000. I'm all ears to explain the text. Again, all of these are literary questions. They had choice. They had a choice to put down what number they wanted. Remember, we're not dealing with fact. We're dealing with representations, literary. So there must have been a literary reason why they put in 75,000, and the same thing about the tree. Why was the tree when it's absurd? I mean, you can't do anything with a tree that's 160 feet. Even to hold it, you'd have to have wires to hold the thing. I mean, so on. So the point is, if we're saying it's representative of different things, of the big concepts were the 5 leaders in the story, but of the smaller things, it's representative, well, then there's a literary analysis, a literary reason. And
I always think that maybe there was some other story that it was paralleling that had that number, and that story never came down to us.
could be. On these things, one has to, even though you ask literary questions, but one has to bow to the possibilities. You may be right. And sometimes in the Chumash you have two or three stories, 2 accounts of the same thing, basically, but they're coming from two different orientations, and so there are a lot of things that are alike and a lot of things that are really different when you look at the text carefully. So again, when you have this type of text on top of text, that's an important consideration. You should know that in the ancient world, in Egypt, for example, if you look at the Book of the Dead, when you read the Book of the Dead in the pictorial hieroglyphic before it was alphabetized, if you look at the Book of the Dead, so you see that there are, what do I want to say? I looked over there because it used to be on that shelf. I had the Book of the Dead.
Stories that parallel other
So right. So that when in the ancient world, when things changed, and the theology needed upgrading, they did not erase. They added. It's as if they said, put this in a bracket and take Bimcombe what I'm writing now, or what I'm pictorializing now. And so in the text, if you look at the text, the Book of the Dead, you see the one layer of originality, and then you see, like, it just has a little space, and then it gives you the new piece. And you, as the reader, are supposed to be able to separate out the new piece. So it wasn't, the texts had a sanctity. And so you don't change, make a new edition. We make a new edition. You changed your mind. We put footnotes, right? Look, a guy could change his mind. So what do? We write a new thing, or we write an article in the paper to say, well, there were mistakes and this, I changed my mind. Okay, but here you can change your mind, but you just add a chunk and leave as if you're writing a bracket and saying, don't read this now, because that's not relevant, it's past. But what I wrote now is relevant. And so the texts had this character. And of course, any person who's trying to restructure and reformulate Judaism from the bottom up for our time is my whole work and my whole life and others. There's difficulties in terms of how do you get the sources to back it up. So it's not a simple thing. You look at the text. Well, the text has layers of like additions and things, and so you have to bob and weave to how do you get the pieces. How do you get the analysis? And in many places, for me, was a construction. And I left it at that with no evidence and tell the reader that's the construction that comes out of Moshe Rabbeinu having this and this and this concept of the way he looked at things. And this affected the way he looked at the Korban, the way he looked at something else and so on. But it's a construction. And intuition can be very, very right, or very, very wrong. But sometimes we don't have the data, we don't have the material. So an anthropological entry into the time, historical entry into the time, leaves many holes and say, look, the archaeology doesn't help, it doesn't help, the culture doesn't help. I'm going to make some speculations, but that's all I can do. So I do the same thing and say, look, I'm making a few speculations. They're coherent, consistent, put together in a picture. But somebody can come along and say, look, what do you do with all the things in the text that are not coherent with that? Well, you just say, look, that's what I'm presenting and that's where it is. The famous example that I used was the notion of korbanot, which when you analyze and read the material from the anthropological entry, Pedersen, for example, who entered the text in terms of the life and culture of ancient Israel, well, the Mishkan, the whole idea, practice of animal sacrifice in the Chumash is a projection from the temple. The number of sacrifices, the character of the sacrifices were a projection onto the Chumash text, like these parentheses, put a bracket, was a projection that came in from 800 BCE and not 1300 BCE. The consensus of opinion is that when you look at the material, you see that this is the case. And so, when you analyze the thing through, you see that when you take Dvarim, for example, there are pieces in Dvarim that obviously are coming in and being added to the text from a later time, from a later period. In one of the pieces, in one of the books, I showed this in detail, that in Moshe Rabbeinu's discussion at the end of Dvarim, of the curses, 55 curses on Yisrael, if they don't keep the mitzvah, when you analyze those curses, you see that they're not talking about the Hebrews entering Canaan. That's the occasion for Moshe Rabbeinu's speech. After the 40 years, they're ready to come into Canaan. He's not going to be with them. Yeshua is going to lead them in, and so on. That's the time frame. But Moshe Rabbeinu was taking the opportunity at that time to talk about the big picture, what he sees in the future. And one of the things he sees, which was the Bar Mitzvah Parsha of Meir, was that the Jews, Yisrael, are going to enter Canaan, and they're not going to do the mitzvot from Simcha. Right there in the text. And that will put us under. We take it as obligation. We take it as everything, but we don't have the Simcha dimension, the Simcha feel, the Simcha taste, the Simcha music that goes with keeping Hashem's Torah for us. Okay? So Moshe Rabbeinu is looking ahead and saying, well, when you become, in the Shlomo Melech period, we're going to enter big history. Right now we're a nomadic country. We had to explain to Paro who we are, that we even have some clout, some status. We're not in the international world. But when you get into the international world, in the big picture, and you have a temple, and it's going to be pulled on you to make it cultic, like other nations had temples, you lose the distinctiveness of what was going on. So when you put all this whole picture together, so I realized that when it says Korban, and when I say Korban process, in my view, the Korban process in the early pre-monarchy, pre-prophetic period, had to do with shogeg. That's all. Where unintentional acts, things done by not by intention, without intention, are yield or leave a trace in the person, which is on every TV program. In other words, you feel guilty. You didn't do enough. But you're exonerated by the law, by morality. So why do you feel bad? Why do you all of a sudden find yourself in depression, on and off? You didn't do enough for the person. They passed away. But circumstances were such that you did the best you could. But there's a tendency to say, no, that's not the best. You can always do better. And so we focus on the wrong things. Rab Nachman makes a big point of that in his whole understanding of Torah. That we focus on averos, on wrongdoings, instead of proper doings. That we should build our whole self-image on the things that we do, that we accomplish, and not on the things that we miss. And indeed, if you read the Egyptian history, you see the Al-Khayt, every king in Egypt had an Al-Khayt list. Exactly like ours. That was the pattern. The king was responsible for the whole society, was the leader, had to, whether he did shaking or whatever, it's open. But there was a thing that he had to say to exonerate himself from all the averas that the gods would be punishing the next generation for. So, anyway, there's a different slant on the orientation. Okay, so this is about the business of the 75,000. You may be right that there was another story and it was mixed in here and it came down. Again, it's open from the historical point of view and from the literary point of view. The basic point here is that the literary questions have a meaning and call for explanation. And if you don't know, like on the 50, I don't have a good answer. I leave it open for somebody else. The same thing in analyzing a novel. When here's a second order character in Tolstoy, and you don't catch what he's doing in the book. You don't catch it. You mix it. You missed it. And somebody else come along and all of a sudden give you a shot and write a paper. And when we teach Tolstoy, we use the new shot because it makes sense. But you could miss it. Okay. The other point is, as I said, there's no word for milchama. It's not a war. It's revenge. So given my sensitivity to this whole idea of revengeance, I said, maybe the root is not nakah, nun kuf hey. The root is naki.
Cleanse.
a very bad word because it's all over Mein Kampf. But if you read Mein Kampf, you'll see part of the Hitler language was this idea of cleaning up society, existing Germany for the new Germany. And when we talked about Heidegger, that was the same point. The claim was that Heidegger he wanted to be rector of the university. He was only stayed a year, but he had to join the party. He joined the Nazi party and so on. And his goal was apparently, as he says, and I read some of the secondary literature at their implicit request of Gene and Ellen, who said, look, I should, at least even for myself, to know more about the whole situation. I found the book on German existentialism here that was on that corner. I cleaned up the corner. I found the book here where in 1933, in his entry into Freiburg in the university, somebody put out a book, a thin book here, of the speeches that he made to the student body and the organization of students to how to, he found jobs, 600 jobs for the youth and so on, and his whole concern was to get a grassroots movement up from the bottom to change the character of the university. It became pseudo-intellectual. It became just, spouting of opinions with no scholarship and no work behind it. And Heidegger, in his work, in his whole analysis, and in his relation to the Nazi Party and everything, was decrying the situation of this. Now, when you look at the material, you see that this is a serious thing. I mean, that was historical reality, because Wagner in music had the same thing. Wagner wanted to get away from fixed musical forms of classical opera and introduce the new orientation. Nietzsche was concerned with beyond good and evil, would stop moralizing so much, stop giving Musser, get down to more substantive things about how a person looks at himself, how a person looks at others. If you don't give yourself kavod, you won't give others kavod. And so Nietzsche, as a German in the same, earlier time slot in 1890, 1900, and so on. Nevertheless, there was this pseudo-intellectualism, call it that way, in Germany at the time, and Nietzsche and Wagner in particular, felt that he wanted to do something to undo that, to shake up things, to upgrade the quality of the university, to return Germany to what it was in the era of Kant and Hegel, the great philosophers and so on, in the 18th century. So it has to be put into the picture. How to evaluate it remains open. But the point is, you do see that he was concerned with that. Nietzsche, I taught Nietzsche for many years, and in Nietzsche was Wagner's assistant, his secretary. He lived in Wagner's house for a year and a half, and he saw from the way Wagner talked, Sichas Chulin, over the breakfast table, and then in the music, and he saw that Wagner was not going to succeed in doing what he thought he was going to do. He was going to really provide a thrust for totalitarianism, for what eventually became nationalism and Nazi Germany, National Socialism in 1933. But so Nietzsche, 30 years before, had seen all of this thing, and he wrote 4 books against Wagner and 4 books against Christianity, because he saw that they are not fulfilling the orientation of the new man that he was talking about. And Heidegger is in the same boat. He wrote a big 4-volume work on Nietzsche, wherein he says the same basic orientation and builds up Nietzsche's understanding of logic, of metaphysics, of psychology when he was strong, but not on logic, metaphysics, and science. There were things in the making. This is 1900, right? Nietzsche 1890, 1900, 1905 is Einstein, 1900 is Planck, this is the beginning of the generation, is the new scientific world. A fantastic, unbelievable revolution in science and technology. Technology had to wait till after the war to develop, but implicit in that was this whole reorientation. And so that you do have in Heidegger, you do have it in Nietzsche, and indeed the early translations of Nietzsche in 1920, he died in 1900, he had brain damage from 1890 to 1900, he had syphilis, his sister was in charge, took charge of his writings, he was still writing, he wrote a great book called The Will to Power at that time. This Zarathustra book, Das Sprache Zarathustra, was earlier, and so on. And Nietzsche had a 30-year period of great creativity, and he was still very creative in the latter part of the 19th century. Okay, and then his sister got the rights to his work, and she changed passages and so on, and just the very title, The Will to Power, already sounds and smells and has the thing of totalitarianism. And so Nietzsche had to be redone. And so the translations in English from 1920 reflect this concern of Nietzsche. And then the guy Walter Kaufmann from Princeton in the 40s retranslated all of the Nietzschean corpus and realized and put out what today is the standard texts, translations into English of Nietzsche material. Nietzsche incidentally changed the German language. He had to develop phraseology that moved out of the classical language of Germany. German was the classical language for science, for civilization, and so on. In any event, so I remember, in response to Jean and Ellen, I did take the time, when I taught Nietzsche, I did take the time to talk about this topic, of how he was misunderstood. Because Nietzsche's the one who said the biggest abomination in Western civilization is the making of a New Testament, connecting it to the Old Testament, and calling it one book, the Bible. Now, if you can't put that in your pipe, there's nothing to smoke. But Nietzsche, his critique of Judaism and Jews was of practicing Jews in Germany who were part of the pseudo-intellectualism and the fakery and everything else, aside from the economic dimensions. He was critical of that, but not of his understanding of Judaism. Of Judaism, his understanding was that it was based on life, on yay to life. His favorite phrase is yay to life, what I call life energy, or what's life energy in the healing tradition and so on. Nietzsche's word was his phrase was yay to life. And his book, the famous book, Beyond Good and Evil. It doesn't capture enough. It's not rich enough to capture the fullness of the human being. We're dealing with the fullness of the human being. And even Freud says he had to pay the big debt to Nietzsche because the psychologizing that Nietzsche did was penetrating and focused, and says we have to look at the human being and civilization in a wider frame and not narrow it down into obligation, mitzvot, and so on. For me personally, as you probably know from hearing it in the past, I found Nietzsche to be a tremendous influence on my understanding of Torah and the whole orientation. And I taught Nietzsche for about 6-7 years, and I, like usual, I taught for myself, and whatever I was out loud, the students got. But I learned a lot from working through the Nietzsche material, in this framework, away from the old translations and the new translations, which brought out aspects that are so typically Jewish as the backdrop for what Nietzsche said. What I quoted you was more or less his words, biggest abomination in Western civilization. And while I'm on the topic, Freud is the same way. I brought Freud back into the world of Judaism because his critique, he wanted to be remembered as making a critique of religion, of Christianity especially, not of Judaism. He identified Judaism with the life system of psychoanalysis. And I'm not the only one who got it. Yerushalmi, the great historian, who was at Columbia, he just passed away recently, an Israeli, an old-timer, an old man. He took the Baron chair for Jewish history, and in his book on Moses, he in effect says, the last chapter, he says, I'm going to have a dialogue with Freud, and he said, you probably didn't want us to know this, but you backed into Judaism without knowing it. This part of Judaism, this richness, when you look at Judaism from the big picture, and with all of its richness, it compares to nothing else. It's fantastic. But our tendency is to shrink it, contract it into a very low order framework of living, where today we're now suffering from the movement out. And our problem is, how do we get the movement in? How do we restore the greatness that we've lost, that's come down over the centuries? Okay, so the point I just wanted to make was the last point about Nakama. I said, look, maybe it's not talking vengeance. It's coming from Naki, to clean up. And clean up means there's a place in society to take action against those who kill. I, for one, had many years difficulty accepting the death penalty. I mean, how could you be pro-life and no matter what the person did, he took another life? But so why take a third? I mean, why take another one as the punishment? And to end, one of the things I read about ancient Egypt was that when somebody had, there was a period of time when somebody had a murdered somebody, they built up his land along the Nile and left it to chance about rainfall and things, whether or not he would survive. If he didn't survive, it wasn't the society that did it. See, it wasn't a court that said, we sentence you to death and here's the chamber and we watch the picture of the electric chair. No, he didn't have that. He said, we're doing it. You're going to get the death penalty. Unless, quote, the gods are good to you and you've got rainfall and this and that. Now I thought that was a fantastic thing. I never heard of that. I read it in one of the books on Egypt, on ancient Egypt. Okay, but I personally always had the death penalty problem of death penalty. But I realized that there is a place in society, and Judaism does make a place, for the death penalty. It says, sure, a court that sentenced somebody to the death penalty once in 50 years or whatever was not really doing its job. Okay, whatever. But the point is, reluctantly, there is the death penalty, and it has a place in society. But I'm very weak on supporting it, because my inner soul and thrust is life-oriented in such a way that it's somehow incongruous. But I leave it open, but on a personal basis, it has its place. Okay, what I try to do tonight was just to fill in some of the details, the linguistic details and the substantive details of the talk that I gave a year ago, which presented the big picture of why it's a historical novel and what the thing was all about, and talked about the universal religion and so forth. I tried to just, in the process of tonight, recall some of those motifs so that the reader or listener can go back and listen to that tape, though this is independent. Listen to that tape and then put this two together to fill it in with more detail. And there's still plenty more to go for next year.